Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs, and this is Sally Ann. And today we're going to talk...
My last name is Sack.
What did I say?
Sally Ann.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry, Sally Ann Sack. I'm so used to saying this. After 10 years, I got to know our names. We're going to talk about the difference... Well, we're going to talk about research facilities. And first of all, I think we have to start with the difference between an archive and a library, and then why we're talking about these places.
Well, yeah, you mean what we're really going to talk about was there really is life before the computer and databases and online everything.
And
genealogy research.
First of all, do you want to explain the difference between a library and an archive?
One has printed material, one has unprinted material. The manuscripts are in archives, documents.
Yeah, and what we really want to point out in talking today is that, people think that everything can be done online. And some of the places that we're going to talk about do have indexes of their materials. Some even have materials online. But there's a ton of stuff that you're not going to find that way. And that's what we want to focus on today. Let's start with the Library of Congress. I mean, they even have books that are not listed if you go there, that are so rare. So you need to...
You mean they're not listed in their online catalog?
They're not listed on their online catalog. They're not even on their little paper catalog. I found a very rare book in their Bragg section.
How did you find it?
Because the archivist brought it out to me.
The archivist or the librarian?
The
librarian brought it out to you.
What's her name?
Peggy Pearlstein.
Peggy Pearlstein brought it out to me because it was written by a supposed ancestor, and it was very, very rare.
And did she say why it wasn't in the index?
Because it was so old.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's one of the things. If you're going to really work the Library of Congress, they have various iterations of their catalog. There's the old catalog and the really old catalog, and so you really, the best advice I have for that is to go to the research librarian. In fact, maybe even make an appointment and really discuss, because those people have a lot of stuff up here.
Yeah, the first thing to do is certainly look at their catalog. Sure. But again, remember that the catalog is only cataloging things in about 35 years, around 1970 when they started. And if you wanted to do something simply like finding out about a village, particularly I know this is true of Germany, so I'm assuming it's true of other places, where a book might have been written about a village that lists people, but it's not in the index because it was written in 1900.
Right.
But now that book might in turn list the baker, the mayor, and there you'll find, all of a sudden you find a relative. So you need to go there. And they've got all sorts of things. They've got a genealogy room, a microfilm room. Certainly on the index it might say they have these things, but you're not going to find like all their newspapers and things they have.
What they have for genealogists is in local history and genealogy. For Jewish genealogists, it's Hebraica. It's newspapers, the microform room they call it. And specialty sections. I go to the Russian area.
And I go to the German area.
Right, and city directories. Now, the city directories, of course, are in local history and genealogy.
Or microform.
Now they're on microform. I used the originals in the stacks. They have, for example, the old Russian city directories that, you may remember they pulled them out of the stacks for our 1988 conference. They were crumbling. They have name upon name upon name. I was sitting with Harold Road and Boris Feldman when Harold said, oh, my family!
Yeah, and the other thing that they have is many old pictures if you want to see what a town is like. They have an incredible number.
Marvelous. And they have old encyclopedias. I found a Belarusian encyclopedia that had my town.
And the old Grimm Brothers lexicon.
For Germany?
Yes, and I've used that many times when I was doing the old reading of the old words that were not found in modern dictionaries. So that's one source. The other source that's here in Washington is
the National Archives.
So, and again, they have all sorts of one-of-a-kind data.
Now they have two facilities, downtown and College Park.
You used to have to go downtown for the census records or the ship records. Again, much of that you find online now.
Right.
So that eliminates that. But they also have other things there.
Yes, they attempted to keep downtown the material that they thought was for genealogists. But in reality, what they put out in College Park can be fabulous as well.
I've got one example of that from the State Department records. Our friend from Australia found the British consular records from when Britain had control over Shanghai.
Yes.
And it lists all the students, it lists the students' names, and he was a student there because the family was escaping from Germany. Now, who would have thought that the American archives has the British records of
Oh,
Shanghai?
have you ever looked at the Shanghai records? I have.
Yeah,
well, you did too.
Yeah, I
those police records, page after page.
Well, I went there, and you know, he told me exactly which records he wanted, and I went down there and photographed them for him and put them on a CD.
I looked at the ones from. They also have Harbin. And I've forgotten the other place. Russians came out through Harbin. I had a relative who had come through Harbin, so there's those records. And also, if you're into wanting illustrations, they have the aerial maps. Have you ever looked at during World War II, the Germans flew over everywhere and took high quality aerial photographs because they were going to bomb.
Yeah.
Well, we have that collection. They also have great still photos.
So we need to point out that you can get maps at both the archives. Those are the photographs, and the old maps themselves are at the Library of Congress.
Oh, right. The map collection is the biggest in the world. At
Yeah,
the Library of
if you want to find a little town or something like that, that's an excellent. And
and those are not cataloged. Those maps are not all cataloged.
And the librarian, you go there and they'll know
what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I want to tell one little story, if I may. I was there during the first, just before the first Gulf War. I was busy doing a book. And in walked two men standing straighter than you think anybody could stand. So you knew they were military. And I just went to eavesdrop. And they were asking for maps of the harbors around Iraq. So I knew what was going on.
Something was coming up there.
Okay.
Now the other thing is the historical societies. And our country has both regular historical and Jewish historical societies. I do want to relate a story. When I was teaching a class on genealogy, and a woman says, you know, I'm really stuck. My grandmother was supposed to have gotten a pension because her husband, who was much older, had served in the Civil War, and they lived in Florida. How would I find something like that? And so I said, well, my guess is try the Historical Society there. Well, Sid went off on a computer and within 5 minutes came back with 5 pages of...
Because that Historical Society
had put those particular pages on all of the request for pensions. And this was a 1910 request. Her husband had just died and she was, you know, obviously much younger than he was. And 5 pages, right there.
Well, you know, I just donated 14 archive boxes of my genealogy papers to the American Jewish Historical Society.
Okay, so
yes, but mostly correspondence, but yes.
So that's another place to check, and not every, and this was, I think, the exception that they'll have that kind of document
online.
Yeah.
Mostly they don't, but those places are invaluable. I can't tell you how many times when you've been stuck, you go to those.
Yeah.
The other, of course, here in Washington, you skipped over the Holocaust Museum. Of course, we've talked about, and I wanted to mention something. We recently taped a show about the Bod Arelson and the trip Gary Mokotov and I made there, and I said that I was looking for every Slumovitz from Marmaros County. Well, I mentioned that to Paul Shapiro at the Holocaust Museum, and he said, do you know that we have all the tax records of the Jews of Marmaros County? I said, I wouldn't have thought of it. How did you get those? He said, because the Germans came in and they wanted money. They rounded up the Jews and they made tax records. And we have the tax records. So
you never know what you're going to find.
That's the point that I wanted to make. When I go to these places, yes, I have in my head what I think they might have, but I always start by finding a specialist and asking them for advice. They know their collections.
Yeah.
And I would never have dreamed of tax records.
The trouble is sometimes, like you said, you don't know what to ask for.
That's right.
And I've been faced with that when I was in an archive in Germany, and I said, I don't know what else to ask for. I know they must have other things. I didn't know what else to ask for.
Exactly. And so that's when you say to them,
what else?
Sometimes they volunteered, but sometimes unless you ask, it won't occur to them.
Now, Yad Vashem, of course, we've talked about before, and they are trying to put everything on the website.
They are putting everything online. The what cannot go online is the ITS documents.
Yeah.
Because that's the agreement. The European countries were extraordinarily sensitive to that issue.
So that makes it all the more important to go there or go to the Holocaust Museum, or as we spoke about in another show, actually go to Arleston too.
Right, and of course, don't forget they have a huge collection at Yad Vashem of testimonials.
Yeah.
Immediate post-war testimonials of survivors.
That's different from the page of testimony.
Yes, this is where they interviewed people, and they're all in all different languages.
Okay.
So that's very important. They also have the world's biggest Yizkor book, memorial book collection. They have a huge library. They have many...
Yizkor book, I should say, are memorial books, basically post-Holocaust.
Right. They have those... The lists that were made post-war in the DP camps, of the people, and many people unfortunately died right after liberation. So sometimes you have those little documents, and help. And then of course you mentioned YIVO.
Yeah.
Actually, it isn't just YIVO. It's now called the Center for Jewish History, and there's YIVO. There's the Leo Baeck Institute.
They're all part of it now.
And the American Jewish Archives.
I didn't know whether they had combined yet. They're all in the same building.
They're all in the same building. They are. They're becoming increasingly sharing, but they have. Where do we start? I guess you look at their catalogs online, but you.
Yeah, well, on the web it said they had over 360,000 volumes and 22,000 documents of photos, records, posters, letters.
They have the highest records, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society records. They have. You can't believe what they have. They have especially Lithuania. Which is, by the way, underrepresented in other places.
Well, I guess the organization itself started in Lithuania, and then they brought what they had over here.
And American Jewish Archives, which is in Cincinnati. It's the American Jewish Historical Society. I misspoke. That's in New York. And both the American Jewish Archives and the American Jewish Historical Society have documents.
Yeah.
And the American Jewish Historical Society has a document that is the only artifact I have ever seen of my grandfather, who died at the age of 50 during the World War I flu epidemic. They have the Industrial Removal Society records. Have you ever heard of the Industrial? When the Eastern European Jews began to arrive in the United States at the turn of the 20th century,
I knew they tried to.
The German Jews who were here were not happy, wanted them out of New York. So they formed, it sounds so Soviet, doesn't it? The Industrial Removal Organization.
Well, I never heard it called that. Yes,
That's
I knew.
the official name.
Okay, I never
and
heard
they found jobs.
Yes.
And so my grandfather landed in New York and was whisked to Sheboygan, Wisconsin.
Yeah, and then they tried to set up sort of kibbutz type things in Oklahoma, Missouri, Mississippi.
Well, they found jobs. I didn't know they set up things. So there's a postcard. He wrote to them and said, "My wife and children are in New York. I just got a job. I have no money. Can you bring them to me?" That's the postcard I have.
Then, as you said, there's American Jewish Historical Society, which is based in New York, and American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. And they have a lot of synagogue records and that type of thing, cemetery records, old defunct cemeteries.
They have a lot from the South, Charleston's.
And well, that was the oldest parts of
They also have a huge collection of Caribbean Jewish material. Excellent material. Yes.
And again, they're not going to put that stuff on the line.
They have a catalog online. They're putting the Malcolm Stern collection online, I think. His book, excuse me, First American Jewish Families.
Okay, but that's only, again, a part of it.
And you make such a mistake if you overlook that. Now, before I forget it, I just have to tell you, we've just put the last issue of Avotenu for the year to press, and it's the one that people write human interest stories. Yeah. So let me give you an example of something that's similar. A woman wrote that there was this family story that her grandparents met on the ship coming to America, met and fell in love, and she wanted to find proof. Well, she found her grandmother, but she found her grandfather's family. She couldn't find him. She couldn't find him, and she was using the computerized version of the Ellis Island records. Fine, Steve Morris is computerized. Finally, I won't go into the whole long story, something told her, wait a minute, what she looked at said the two daughters had come. But she had heard that one of the sisters had died in the old country, so she went and looked at the original census page. And on the original census page, her grandfather's name was listed as Gittel, and there was an F. But then it said he was a farmer, and somebody had crossed off the F and put an M. But his name wasn't Gittel, it was Hillel. And so you can see Gittel and Hillel if you have a big accent. But somebody computerizing it did it as a Gittel.
I was wondering whether he even came in as pretending to...
no, it said he was a farmer, like his father.
Okay.
So, and then they had crossed it off and put the M.
Okay.
But if she hadn't gone to the original document, and that's what all these things are talking about, is going and looking at documents.
Yeah.
Not some compilations.
That's the trouble with anything that's indexed these days, because anything that's handwritten, you know, the handwritings are so bad, and that's the main trouble with the
Ellis Island.
The Ellis Island records is that the people that wrote it didn't know the German, and
they didn't know the Eastern European at all.
But even the German handwriting, if it's a good handwriting, you know, we gave the example of that Sophia once that that looks like Ophelia. Yeah. They don't know what the letters are. So
no, you mentioned here the Hamburg emigration records. These are so valuable because when, you know, for a large period of time, Hamburg was the major port through which Jews of Eastern Europe emigrated. Bremen earlier and then Hamburg. And those records, which were filled out before the ship left the shore, listed the last residence abroad, and also, was that the one that it had that some of the others didn't have? They have some documentation, I can't remember what it is offhand, that isn't on our ship arrival records. Also, I know what it is, they have last residence abroad before the U.S. required it.
Okay.
The U.S. didn't require it until 1907. Their records go way back. So you can be in the 1880s and have it.
These Hamburg records, I've seen there are these books, but is that more than these books of lists of names?
Oh, yes, much more. Much more. It was online free for a while. I think you can still access the index free, but that you pay to get the document. I think they're on Ancestry. But if you Google Hamburg emigration with an E, you'll get them.
And of course, newspapers. Then
more stories.
Huh? More stories. Yeah.
Well, the Library of Congress has a program with the National Endowment for the Humanities to microfilm old historical newspapers in the United States, all over the United States. And one of the great stories in this issue is about a man who was told that his great-grandfather was, quote, active in the Jewish community in St. Louis. Long and short was, he went to Columbia, Missouri, where the Historical Society had the microfilms of the old newspapers, and it was his habit to look for obits around the time of the death. He didn't find anything. Something told him to look in the Jewish newspapers. He ended up with enough material for a full-scale biography. There was so much on that great-grandfather over the years in these Jewish newspapers, which is why Avotenu is working on a book to list all the Jewish newspapers that ever existed.
Has Columbia, Missouri?
That's where they are.
Have they indexed these, or do you have to sit?
Sat and went like that.
But have they microfilmed it?
Yes.
So you are sitting. You're not looking at touching the original papers.
He said something that I have to clarify with him. He said it's not indexed, but then he talked about his grandfather's name popping out at him from an index card. So there's something there that isn't clear.
It could be major stories or something like that, but not everything.
Yes. And Columbia, Missouri has the Jewish newspapers of St. Louis. I know you're interested because of your husband's. And the forward?
The forward is certainly, and that I guess is found in New York, and it's certainly still a newspaper today, although not in Yiddish anymore.
Right.
And the Aufbau
was that German newspaper.
Is a post-World War II German newspaper.
And that was the in search. Did they have lots of in search of, or
hundreds.
Missing relative records?
They had in search of. You put down for birthdays. You put down for deaths. You know, I have some of the. Not by my parents, we didn't do it anymore, but my great aunt and others.
Right.
And that could be, you know, people in South America, South Africa got that. I mean, that was worldwide then.
I didn't realize that, but the other, you make me think of something we haven't mentioned. Israel has many things, not just Yad Vashem. And one of the things, you know, Jews used to buy trees for the reforestation of Palestine when we went to Sunday school.
$1, yes.
All right, the Karen Kayemet has something called the Golden Books that have lists of people. You can look them up by name. They're alphabetical. People would buy donate money in honor of somebody's anniversary, in honor of a bar mitzvah, in honor of a birth. And I went and got all the Amders and all the Dubners and all the, if you have rare names.
I was at a meeting the other...
Especially from South Africa, they came for something.
I was at a meeting the other day, and a local politician was given a tree as, thank you for being... She says, I'll add this to my collection. I have 21 trees growing over there now. So that's still being done.
Right, exactly. And those are great collections of things. Now, you mentioned draft records, which I believe are at the archives. No? Well, they're online.
There's some, and there's places like the Jewish War Veterans Play, too, which I didn't mention. And I don't know that they have much online at all. I really don't know. I've never checked there. But for the newspapers that we didn't mention, again, a big plug for looking through ProQuest at your local library from the New York Times. Even though your ancestor was an unimportant so-and-so, another article that I just published was about a grandfather about whom he knew nothing, who had worked in a box cut factory. He was a box cutter. And there was he was in the New York Times and others because he'd gotten beaten up on the picket line. And he found all sorts of information. So that New York Times index, so many people have said to me, I didn't really think there would be anything, but another story was about a woman. 3 sisters survived the war. 1 sister was killed. They were from Poland. 2 sisters came back to Poland. They were in Russia and came back. They lost the 3rd. She had gone through the concentration camp system, and they had heard she'd gone to America and had a son. They tried to trace her. If the International Tracing Service had been open, they'd have found her while they were still alive. Ultimately, the niece who got out of Poland moved to Israel. She was a niece in her 60s, found her first cousin through the Los Angeles Times Index. Oh my God.
Yeah. And that boy he's a man, excuse me.
Yeah.
I said, it was the most amazing thing of his life to find out he had relatives. So, again, these newspapers, you never know how they might have been involved in anything.
Yeah, but it's hard sometimes to know which newspaper to look at. But I think Ancestry doesn't, if you search through Ancestry, if they find that name at all.
Right, they show you. Yeah, this is true. Well, they knew that she had been in Los Angeles and had been accused of murder. She was a housekeeper, and then she'd been exonerated. But in the meantime, this boy had lived in an orphanage while his mother was in jail, awaiting trial. It was a horrible, horrible story. But and then Edward Luft, who lives here in town and loves to do rare things, has been using court records in New York and discovered a whole mess of stuff. They've now indexed. It's not online. They've indexed their court cases, and he was able to find his great-great-great-grandmother in a bankruptcy case. And through that, learned a huge amount.
And he also found those land records using the land tax, the tax records.
Right.
And we had somebody once that talked about that if you owned land, you had to keep up the road from front of you, the tax for the road.
Right.
Which is, again, that's not going to be online. So you have to go to the local courts, to the local when you really get stuck. I mean, that's obviously not the first thing you do.
And the other thing I have to say is the cemeteries.
Yeah.
Not all the cemetery burials are online or ever going to be online. Go to the cemeteries.
Yeah, or try to find the funeral homes if they still exist, because they're not going to put their stuff online because they want you to come and.
Well, even so, there's no reason for them to put them online.
Well, we went to the very old one in St. Louis, and we found a lot of my husband's family, and they were all computerized, beautifully kept up cemetery from the 1800s, and they were very, very nice. And
yes, the funeral homes, in my experience, have been extraordinarily helpful, especially in the small. Well, yours was in St. Louis. This might have been small towns.
The funeral home is more, on the whole, what I found is more helpful than the cemetery. In one place in Chicago, Rose Hill, nobody's buried here by that name. I knew she was buried there by that. It was Sid's grandmother.
Did you ever find the grave?
Yes. It was, the cemetery had her under Ray, and we were asking for Rachel. Ray was her nickname. And Ray, she was always called Ray, but we were asking by her full name. So we went to the funeral home that's not too far from there, and we've got to go back there sometime. This many Sachs and Seligs. And yeah, there we
exactly.
And the funeral home then told us exactly where, you know, the location of the cemetery. We went to the cemetery, got, you know, and then
that's the other point. You would know that Ray was also Rachel.
Yeah.
And in fact,
I mean, we had the exact date.
Sure. Sure.
And you know, you'd think that guy would have said, "Could that be Ray?" I mean, we had the exact date she was buried. It was like 1959 or something.
So,
it wasn't
so
that.
You had the feeling that he just wanted you to go away.
Yes, absolutely. It was not a Jewish cemetery. But you know, so you could run into things like that occasionally.
Oh, that's interesting.
He just didn't feel like being helpful.
So
anyway, the point of what we're trying to do is that you cannot do it all.
You can't do it all in your slippers and bathrobe in front of your computer at midnight.
No, you can do a lot,
right?
And that's certainly the place to start. But eventually,
be careful, because you're going to find errors, and don't let that. And that's what worries me.
But you know, what I like about Ancestry, which we can access in Fairfax County from the library, I'm sure from Montgomery County, you can access it from the library. That very often they have the document, and you just click on it, and you see the document, then you know what they filled out.
Right.
So that, but you know, people make mistakes on documents.
Well, I showed you one where, you know, the survivor made a mistake on the maiden name of mother.
Okay, well, I hope that helps people.